Now that we understand how to create basic objects, let's go ahead and go a little bit further and model those to create more complex ones. Now we're going to be working with mesh or polygon editing here, and then we'll go ahead and move into curve-based editing in a little bit. Now mesh editing is basically accomplished by adding modifiers to an object. So we can go into modifiers, and you'll see that we have a number of different categories of modifiers. The one that we want to look for is mesh editing, and you'll see that we have a lot of these. But the two main ones are edit mesh and edit poly, and these will allow us to do more free-form modeling. Now we can get to it from here, or we can go over here to the command panel, and under the modify tab, you'll see that we have a modifier list. And if we scroll down, you'll see that we have all of these same modifiers. They're just not organized like they are in the interface. But I'm going to go ahead and select Edit Poly. Now, Edit Poly is the one that you'll probably want to use with modeling because it has more tools, it's more interactive, it makes modeling a lot easier. So once we go into Edit Poly mode, you'll see that we actually are creating what's called a stack. So we have our basic box here. And then on top of that, we have Edit Poly. So when we select this Edit Poly modifier, we can go into our selection and start selecting parts of the object. So we have vertex, edge, border, polygon, and element. So vertices are these. So if I wanted to, I could just left click and drag and start pulling those around. So I can actually start interactively reshaping this a vertice at a time. We can also go into edges, and you can see the edges are the lines that connect vertices. And then we also have faces, so we can modify really any one of those. Or we can use vertices, edges, and faces as the basis for further modeling. Now we're going to start with edges here, and we're going to take a look at chamfer, which is a very common operation. So let's say we wanted to turn this box into a table, but we want to chamfer the edges. We want to round off the edges of this object. Well, we can do that by selecting multiple edges. And if we want to actually select a lot of edges, we can basically shift select those, or we can use some handy tools. So if I shift select multiple ones here, and I go up here, I can actually select what's called a loop, and that will select all the edges that are connected. So if I continue to hold down shift and select two more edges on opposite faces and select loop, you can see that I can select the whole top edge of the table. And then if I shift select, I can select these downward edges here. And then I can do the same along the bottom. So I can shift select one edge on each side here. And again, I'm holding down the shift key. And then select loop again. And you'll see that I have basically all the outside edges of this object selected. Now once I have them selected, we can now do a chamfer. So if I select chamfer here and go into settings, you'll see that I get this really nice interface. And you can see that the chamfer is already starting. So we have a number of controls here, and these are listed here. If we look at this top box right here, this will tell you what each one of these controls does. So this is the amount of chamfer, so how much of that. This is how many segments. So as you can see, I can add detail here. We can open it or not. Okay, well, we're not going to not do that. And then here we can also change the chamfer type. So if I click from this triangle to a square, you can see how it's a squared off chamfer versus a rounded one. Well, we want a rounded one. And so once we get all of this dialed in, just hit this checkbox, and now that is part of the model. So now I have a rounded box. Well, let's go ahead and turn this box into a table. I want to go ahead and add some legs. And we can do that by extruding what are called faces. So I can go into this same Edit Poly modifier and select polygons here, or I can add another one to the stack. And let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go into Modifiers, Mesh Editing, Edit Poly. So now I have 2 edit polys on my stack, and I'm going to go ahead in this second one and go into polygon mode. And again, I'm going to select just the underside corner polygons of that box. And we can extrude these now to make legs. So if I go down into Edit Polygons Rollout, you'll see that I have an Extrude tab. So if I click on that, you'll see that it gives me a very similar control panel here. So I have one here for group normals, and then I have one for height. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring down the height of that. So now I'm getting some legs. Now this edit polygon is live, so one of the things I can do is I can deselect those, and if I click off of those, you'll notice how that goes away. So I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo that. So sometimes you may accidentally deselect things while you're in this operation, and all you have to do is undo that to get back to it. Now once we have this in place, just hit check, and there we go. Now, bevel is very similar to extrude, and in some ways it can be functionally identical. And what bevel is that it's an extrude where you can bring the top face either in or out. So let's take a look at how that works. So I'm going to go ahead into the settings for bevel, and we still have these bottom 4 faces selected. So with bevel, I can again do a height. So in this case, this is very similar to an extrude. But I have this second control here called outline, which allows me to either bring that top face in or out. So I can either make it bigger or smaller at the end. And this is what's called a bevel. So you can use the bevel tool as an extrude, or if you want, you can use it as a bevel tool. And just like with extrude, we hit check mark to lock that in. Now, the nice thing about using the stack in 3ds Max is that we can turn on and off our edits. So this top edit here was for the legs, and if I hit this little eye icon, I can turn that on or off. I can do the same for the other one, so I can turn on and off those chamfers. So what this does is it gives us a live history of our object that we can use. Now, in addition to Edit Poly, we do have Edit Mesh. And Edit Mesh is a little bit more primitive than Edit Poly. So let's go ahead and just take a look at Edit Mesh. I'm going to go ahead and throw that on the top of the stack. And as you can see, we also have vertices, edges, faces, and polygons. Now, we don't have borders on this one. But if I select, say, a polygon, and scroll down to Edit Geometry, notice how we don't really have a separate bevel command. We have an extrude and a bevel, which can work on the same set of polygons. And we don't have that fancy interface that kind of floats in the viewport. So this is a little bit more primitive. It was the original part of 3ds Max, and Edit Poly has, to some degree, superseded it. But you can still use both. Anyways, those are some of the basics of how to edit polygons, as well as how to use the stack in 3ds Max.